So that the question is, why this particular kind of people are the targets of so much venomous hatred? And I think the answer is that they not only succeed, they succeed in a way which is a threat to the egos of other people. That is, you can envy a Rockefeller, but he's no threat to your ego, because you say, listen, anybody can be rich if he's born a Rockefeller. But the guy who comes here, let's say from Vietnam or Korea, and arrives here with little more than the clothes on his back and a few words of broken English, and a decade later he has his own little business, and you see his son a few years after that getting ready to go off to Harvard or MIT, you got to ask yourself, you either got to, you've got to hate yourself for saying, my God, I've been stagnating, this guy was nothing and now he's risen up, or you're going to have to hate him. And most people, when they have a choice between hating others and hating themselves, they hate others.
If history has shown us anything, it's that people do not always admire success, they resent it. The Jews have been hated for centuries, and if you look at the pattern, it has little to do with their religion, their culture, or even where they live. They have been expelled from countries where they were prominent capitalists and from places where they were poor laborers. They have been persecuted in times of economic hardship and in times of economic prosperity. If there were a consistent reason for their persecution, it should have changed based on circumstances, but it hasn't. And why? Because human nature hasn't changed. I have often said, when people are given the choice between hating themselves for their own failures or hating others for their success, they will hate others for their success. The Jews have time and again proven the second part of that equation. They arrive in new lands with nothing, and through careful habits, discipline, and economic ingenuity, they rise. And when they rise, so does resentment. It is one of the great tragedies of human nature, that people see the success of others as a threat rather than an example. This is not unique to the Jews, of course. The Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Lebanese in West Africa, the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, all have faced similar fates. These groups, much like the Jews, did not rely on government handouts or special privileges. They relied on work, on trade, on intellect. And when they rose to prominence, the hatred followed. Why? Because their success exposed the failures of others. And no one likes to be reminded that their own shortcomings are their own doing. Today, we see the same phenomenon in a different form. Anti-Semitism has not disappeared, it has simply adapted. The language has changed, but the resentment remains the same. The old accusations of controlling the economy have morphed into claims about privilege. The same people who say they oppose racism have no problem condemning an entire group for being too successful. And the irony is that the only way to avoid this hatred would be to stop succeeding. It's something no rational person should ever entertain. History does not deal in accidents. Jews have been hated in different places at different times for seemingly different reasons. But if you strip away the rhetoric, the pattern is clear. Economic niches lead to resentment. In medieval Europe, Jews were often barred from owning land, so they became financiers, moneylenders, and traders. This was not because they had some special love for finance, but because they had no other choice. And yet, when governments needed loans, they turned to Jewish bankers. When people needed credit, they turned to Jewish moneylenders. But when the debts became too high, when resentment festered, suddenly these same Jews were accused of exploitation and expelled. The pattern repeated across Europe for centuries. The same thing happened with the Chinese in Indonesia, the Indians in Uganda, and the Lebanese in Sierra Leone. In each case, a minority filled an economic gap, provided a valuable function, and eventually became resented for it. And in each case, expelling them led to economic collapse. You would think people would learn from history, but instead they repeat it. The Jews have been accused of controlling banks, industries, and media. But ask yourself this, if it were true, if these industries were really so tightly controlled, wouldn't the people complaining about it simply outperform them? If Jewish success were due to some conspiracy, then logically, any other group could copy that conspiracy and achieve the same results. But that's not what happens, because the real answer is much simpler. Discipline, education, and economic foresight lead to prosperity, and prosperity breeds resentment. One of the great fallacies of economic thinking is the notion that middlemen do not produce anything. You hear this argument constantly, that shopkeepers, financiers, and traders are merely leeching off of others. This is not only wrong, it is dangerously wrong. Middlemen serve a vital role in any economy. They allocate resources, stabilize supply chains, and reduce transaction costs. They create efficiency where inefficiency exists. And yet, time and again, they have been the targets of economic scapegoating. Consider the role of Jewish traders in Eastern Europe. Farmers produced grain, but getting that grain to market required coordination. Jewish traders filled this role. They found buyers, negotiated prices, and ensured that supply met demand. But rather than being seen as facilitators, they were painted as parasites. The same accusations were made against Indian traders in Africa, against Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, and against the Chinese in the Philippines. The accusations were not based on economic reality. They were based on resentment. The truth is, middle minorities are hated precisely because they succeed without political power. They do not rely on governments or special favors. They do not control armies or command bureaucracies. They succeed through market forces alone. And that is why they are resented, because their success disproves the notion that prosperity can only come through oppression. Now, if we accept that persecution and discrimination do not necessarily prevent success, then we must ask a difficult question. Why have Black Americans and much of Africa failed to follow this pattern? Historically persecuted groups have risen when left to their own devices. But Black Americans, unlike the Jews, the Chinese, or the Lebanese, have seen stagnation where others have seen progress. And the question is, why? The answer, as uncomfortable as it may be, is culture. The Jews valued education and discipline. The Chinese valued thrift and patience. The Lebanese valued commerce and adaptation. But what has modern Black culture emphasized? Victimhood, grievance, dependency. This was not always the case. Black Americans once had thriving business districts, successful professionals, and strong families. In the early 20th century, Black literacy rates were rising faster than white literacy rates. Black business ownership was growing. But then came the welfare state. Then came policies that rewarded dependency and discouraged self-reliance. And rather than competing, rather than adapting, the culture shifted toward blame. In Africa, the pattern is even worse. Colonialism is blamed for every failure, yet the most prosperous African nations today, Botswana for instance, succeeded precisely because they did not embrace victimhood. Meanwhile, countries that expelled their middleman minorities, like Uganda under Idi Amin, collapsed economically, and yet people continue to cling to the illusion that failure is the fault of others rather than the result of poor choices. Hatred of successful groups is not a relic of history. It is alive and well today. The language has changed, but the fundamental resentment remains. In modern times, this resentment is fueled not just by economic envy, but by an entire political ideology that thrives on grievance and division. And nowhere is this clearer than on the political left. For decades, the left has promoted a worldview that portrays success as oppression and failure as victimhood. They have replaced the concept of self-improvement with the concept of grievance. Instead of looking at why some groups succeed, they focus on ways to justify why others fail. And rather than learning from successful groups like the Jews, they vilify them. Look at the rhetoric that is common today. We are told that disparities between groups are proof of discrimination. But if that were true, then why do we see the same patterns across completely different societies? Why do Chinese minorities dominate business in Malaysia? Why do Indians control much of the economy in East Africa? Why are Jews prominent in finance, medicine, and academia across Western nations? If success were simply a matter of privilege, then these groups, who are often persecuted, should have failed, but they didn't, and that is precisely why they are hated. The left's obsession with group identity ensures that the resentment never fades. They constantly push the idea that success is unfair, that it comes at someone else's expense. This is why they attack meritocracy, because meritocracy disproves their entire worldview. If success is based on hard work, education, and discipline, then failure must be based on the absence of those things. And that is a reality that many people do not want to face. The irony is that the left claims to fight discrimination, yet their rhetoric fuels the very hatred they claim to oppose. They promote the idea that Jews are overrepresented in elite fields, that their success is somehow suspicious. But what exactly is the alternative? That Jews should deliberately hold themselves back to appease others? That they should stop succeeding to avoid resentment? If that is the standard, then what happens to society as a whole? Should we discourage excellence in all forms just to avoid offending those who refuse to compete? That is the road to decline. One of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming that policies can be judged solely by their intentions rather than by their actual consequences. And nowhere is this clearer than in identity politics. We are told that affirmative action, diversity quotas, and wealth redistribution are necessary to correct historical injustices. But do these policies actually help the people they claim to help? Or do they simply create new resentments, new divisions, and new failures? Take affirmative action, for example. If a university admits students based on race rather than merit, what happens? The students who were admitted under lower standards struggle. Many drop out. Meanwhile, resentment grows among those who were rejected despite being more qualified. And the long-term effect is a society that devalues achievement while reinforcing the idea that success is based on favoritism rather than hard work. The same applies to economic policies. The left pushes for higher taxes on the wealthy, wealth redistribution, and greater government intervention. But history has shown that when you punish success, you do not create prosperity, you simply drive the successful elsewhere. And the resentment remains because people still refuse to face the uncomfortable truth that economic disparities exist not because of discrimination, but because different groups make different choices. If we are to have an honest conversation about why some groups succeed while others fail, we must acknowledge a reality that many people refuse to accept. Culture matters. The Jews, the Chinese, the Lebanese, the Armenians, these groups did not rise because they were given special privileges. They rose because they cultivated habits that led to success. They valued education. They embraced long-term thinking. They fostered strong families and work ethics. And they passed these values down through generations. Now compare that to cultures that reject these values. Compare that to communities that glorify grievance rather than self-discipline. Compare that to societies that reward dependency rather than self-reliance. Is it really any surprise that the outcomes are different? Take Black Americans as an example. In the early 20th century, Black communities were rising economically. They had strong family structures, low crime rates, and a growing middle class. But then government policies, encouraged by the left, created a culture of dependency. The welfare state rewarded single motherhood. The education system abandoned rigorous standards. The media promoted victimhood rather than achievement. And the result, decay. The same is true in Africa. Many African nations gained independence in the mid-20th century. They had abundant natural resources, growing populations, and economic potential. But rather than embracing the principles that lead to prosperity, market economies, rule of law, education, they embraced corruption, ethnic division, and state control. And today, they remain far behind other developing regions. These are not accidents. They are choices. And choices have consequences. If history teaches us anything, it is that success is never permanent. Civilizations rise and fall based on the values they embrace, and when societies begin punishing success rather than learning from it, decline is inevitable. Look at the great empires of the past. The Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire. They did not collapse because they were conquered by superior forces. They collapsed from within. They abandoned the principles that made them great. They rejected merit, embraced entitlement, and weakened themselves through internal division. The same pattern is happening in the West today. We are witnessing a culture that resents success, that discourages excellence, and that promotes grievance over growth. And history tells us exactly where this road leads. If we continue down this path, the future is not difficult to predict. The most successful groups, whether Jews, Asians, or other minorities, will continue to be scapegoated. Governments will implement more policies that punish achievement and reward mediocrity. And over time, the foundations of prosperity will erode. But here's the thing about reality. It does not care about ideology. It does not care about grievances. It does not care about fairness. It simply rewards those who make the right choices and punishes those who do not. The question is not whether resentment against Jews or other successful groups will continue. It will. The real question is whether society will learn from success or attempt to destroy it. We have two options. We can continue blaming disparities on imaginary oppression, fostering resentment, and punishing those who rise. Or we can recognize that success is not a crime, that discipline and education matter, and that the real solution is to raise standards, not lower them.